A storm unlike any the town had seen was tearing through the night when a young boy vanished into the woods after his dog. Hours later, as hope faded and searchers gave up, one car stopped on that empty road. Behind the wheel was Keanu Reeves. What he discovered in the darkness would change everything. Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. The sun had barely set over the quiet farmlands of Oregon when the first low rumble rolled across the valley. It wasn't the kind of sound that made people run for cover, just the distant growl of a sky gathering strength. The air was heavy and damp, carrying that metallic scent that always comes before rain. On the edge of a narrow dirt road stood a small farmhouse, weathered but proud, its windows glowing with the soft amber light of evening. 10-year-old Ethan Cole stood barefoot in the yard, tossing a worn tennis ball toward his golden retriever, Buddy. The dog leapt after it with the boundless joy only dogs and children seem to have. Each time Buddy brought it back, Ethan's laughter cut through the stillness of the countryside. For a moment, the world was simple, just a boy, his best friend, and the endless stretch of green fields behind their home. From the open kitchen window, Sarah Cole stirred a pot of stew on the stove, smiling at the sound of her son's laughter. Her life hadn't been easy since her husband left 2 years earlier. She'd learned to fix tractors, balance bills, and mend fences on her own. Ethan was her reason to keep going, the heartbeat that kept the house alive. She called out through the screen door, "Ethan, honey, dinner's almost ready!" Ethan waved back, but didn't come in. He wanted one more throw, one more chase. Above him, gray clouds thickened, folding over the sky like a closing curtain. A cool gust swept through the fields, bending the grass and sending a chill through his thin t-shirt. Buddy barked once, uneasy, then turned toward the woods as if something had caught his attention. Sarah leaned against the doorframe, looking up. The light had dimmed faster than usual. The weather forecast earlier that morning had warned of possible storms, but no one in town expected anything serious. Still, she reached over to turn on the local radio that always sat on the kitchen counter. A static buzz filled the room before a voice came through, tense and sharp. A severe thunderstorm warning is now in effect for Benton and neighboring counties. High winds and flash flooding expected. Please take shelter immediately. Her stomach dropped. She stepped onto the porch and called again, louder this time. "Ethan, inside now." But Ethan's attention was fixed on Buddy, who had bolted toward the tree line, chasing a darting shadow, a squirrel disappearing into the woods. "Buddy, wait!" Ethan shouted, grabbing his small flashlight from the porch steps before running after him. The beam flickered weakly in the thickening gloom. Within seconds, the rain began. First a few drops, tapping softly against the leaves. Then a sudden torrent, pouring down with force that seemed to come from nowhere. The air roared as the storm hit. Thunder cracked like an explosion, startling the horses in the nearby pasture. Back at the farmhouse, Sarah rushed out, shielding her eyes against the rain. The yard was already slick with mud. "Ethan!" she cried again, her voice straining against the wind. There was no answer, only the violent rustle of branches and the deep growl of thunder rolling across the hills. The storm had begun, and her son was nowhere in sight. The rain fell harder now, drumming against the tin roof of the farmhouse like 1,000 impatient fists. Sarah grabbed her raincoat and boots from beside the door. Her hands trembled as she tried to button the coat, her mind racing with images of Ethan lost somewhere in the dark. She knew the woods well enough by daylight, but at night, with the storm building, even grown men could lose their way. She stepped outside, instantly drenched. The flashlight in her hand wobbled in the wind, the beam barely cutting through the heavy curtain of rain. The sky flashed white, and for a second, she thought she saw movement near the tree line. "Ethan!" she called again, her voice breaking. The wind tore it away. Buddy's bark echoed faintly in the distance, high-pitched and frightened. Sarah's heart leapt. She ran toward the sound, her boots sinking into the mud. Every few feet, she slipped and caught herself, her breath coming in gasps. The rain stung her face. She shouted again, but only thunder answered. Back at the house, the radio crackled with more warnings. Residents are urged to remain indoors, avoid flooded areas and power lines. The lights flickered, then went out completely. The farmhouse went dark, the only sound the relentless rain hammering the roof. Out in the woods, Ethan stumbled through the underbrush, clutching his tiny flashlight. The beam shook in his hand as lightning flashed above. Trees swayed violently, their branches whipping like claws. He called for Buddy again, his voice trembling. "Buddy, where are you?" He tripped over a root and fell, scraping his knee. Mud covered his jeans, soaking through to his skin. His breath came out in shivers. Then, a bark closer this time. He scrambled toward it, pushing through the wet ferns. Finally, he spotted Buddy beneath a leaning tree, trembling, his fur matted and wet. Ethan dropped beside him, hugging the dog tightly. "I found you," he whispered, voice cracking. "I found you, Buddy." The wind howled louder. A tree cracked nearby, splitting with a violent snap. Ethan screamed and threw his arms around the dog. The world had become noise and darkness. He looked back toward where the farmhouse should be, but there was only rain and trees and fear. Back at the edge of the property, Sarah reached the first line of trees, but her flashlight sputtered and died. She fell to her knees in the mud, sobbing his name. "Ethan, please answer me." There was no reply. The rain kept falling, and the forest swallowed every sound. Somewhere deep in those woods, a little boy and his dog huddled together, unaware that the storm was only getting stronger. And down the winding highway miles away, a black car would soon slow to a stop because its driver, a quiet man named Keanu Reeves, would notice the flashing lights of a sheriff's truck in the storm. The storm reached its full fury. Trees bent like they were bowing to the wind, and the sky growled as though the earth itself were angry. Sarah stumbled back toward the porch, soaked to the bone, shaking uncontrollably. Her flashlight had died, and her voice was nearly gone from shouting. Every shadow in the rain looked like her son, and every sound made her heart leap. She burst through the front door and grabbed the phone, praying there was still service. The signal flickered in and out, but she managed to dial the sheriff's number. Her voice cracked as she spoke. "Sheriff Daniels, it's Sarah Cole. Ethan's gone. He ran after the dog. I can't find him." The sheriff's calm but urgent tone came through the static. "Stay inside, Sarah. I'm sending a team. The roads are flooding, but we'll reach you soon. Don't go back out there alone." She hung up and pressed her forehead to the wall, trembling. Lightning illuminated the room, and for a split second, she saw Ethan's muddy shoes still by the door. The sight broke her. She sank to the floor and sobbed, whispering, "Hold on, baby. Please, hold on." Outside, Ethan huddled beneath a small wooden shed he had found near the edge of the woods. It looked abandoned, half the roof missing. One side caved in, but it was shelter. The wind roared like a freight train, and the rain poured through the gaps, pooling around his shoes. He hugged Buddy close, wrapping his arms around the trembling dog. "It's okay," he said through chattering teeth. "We'll stay here until it stops. Mom will find us." Buddy whimpered and licked his face, as if answering. Ethan tried to be brave, but the thunder made him flinch every few seconds. He could feel the water rising under the shed, soaking through his jeans. His flashlight flickered weakly before dying completely. The darkness became total. He pressed his cheek against Buddy's warm fur and whispered, "You're my best friend. Don't be scared." Back in town, the sheriff gathered volunteers near the fire station. Flashlights, rain gear, and search dogs were loaded into trucks. The radio dispatcher's voice cut through the air. "Storm moving northeast. Heavy flooding reported along County Road 7. Sarah Cole's boy," the sheriff muttered, pulling on his hat. "We need to move fast." Dozens of headlights lit up the rain-soaked streets as townsfolk joined the search. Some knew the Coles personally, others didn't. But everyone in a small town understands one truth. When a child is missing, you look, no matter the cost. Meanwhile, miles down the road, a single car crept carefully through the downpour. Its wipers struggled to keep up with the rain. Behind the wheel, Keanu Reeves leaned forward, peering through the glass. his expression focused but calm. He'd been driving for hours, heading home from a film set, when the weather took a turn. As lightning illuminated the night, he noticed the faint red and blue glow of emergency lights ahead. Something inside him, an instinct he never ignored, told him to slow down. He pulled over near the group of trucks gathering by the woods. The storm had drawn its lines. Somewhere in the darkness, fate was preparing to bring them all together. The storm pressed against the mountains like a living thing, its wind bending pine trees and scattering fallen leaves across the wet asphalt. Keanu Reeves gripped the steering wheel of his black SUV as the rain slammed the windshield in violent bursts. He had been driving for hours from a remote film set in northern Oregon, the kind of quiet indie project he loved. Small crew, long nights, meaningful dialogue. Now all he wanted was a warm bed and a silent night. But the world had other plans. His headlights cut through the dark forest road, revealing glimpses of flashing branches and water streaming down the slopes. The rhythmic thud of the wipers gave him a strange sense of calm. He'd always liked driving in the rain. It gave him space to think, to breathe. But tonight, something felt different. The air was restless, and every gust of wind seemed to whisper of something waiting ahead. He thought about how unpredictable life could be. One day you're surrounded by cameras and scripts. The next you're alone on an empty road, just another person in the storm. He remembered his childhood in Toronto. Those nights when his mother would light candles during blackouts. She'd tell him stories to keep the fear away. Even then, he'd learned something simple yet lasting, that light doesn't need to be loud to make a difference. The rain thickened, forcing him to slow down. Through the downpour, he spotted the faint neon glow of an old roadside diner, its sign flickering weakly. Harlan's Grill. It looked closed, but next to it were several vehicles parked at odd angles. Pickup trucks, a police SUV, and a cluster of flashlights bobbing in the dark. The red and blue strobes of a sheriff's truck reflected off the puddles. Keanu instinctively eased his car to the shoulder. Something was happening. He rolled down his window, rain immediately blowing inside. The wind carried shouts, urgent, panicked voices. He could barely make out the words, but one cry stood out clear against the thunder. A woman's voice, raw and trembling. "My son. Please, someone find him." Keanu's chest tightened. Without thinking, he shut off the engine and stepped out. The cold rain soaked through his jacket within seconds. He jogged toward the group near the sheriff's vehicle, shielding his eyes from the wind. Volunteers stood huddled together, some holding leashes attached to dogs in reflective vests. The sheriff, a sturdy man in his 50s, was issuing directions, his radio crackling with static. Keanu approached slowly, not wanting to interrupt. "Evening," he said quietly, his voice steady. "What's going on?" The sheriff turned, squinting through the rain. Recognition flickered for a moment. "Wait, you're..." Keanu gave a small nod but cut him off gently. "Doesn't matter. Looks like you've got a missing kid. Do you need another set of eyes?" The sheriff hesitated, then nodded. "We sure do. 10-year-old boy. Lost in the woods chasing his dog before the storm hit. We've got half the town out here looking." Keanu picked up a spare flashlight from the back of a truck. "Then I'll start where you need me." The sheriff motioned toward the tree line, where volunteers were organizing into groups of 3. "We've got search teams sweeping the east and west trails," he explained. "But the river's rising fast, and the bridge down by the bend is flooded out. The boy's name is Ethan Cole. His mom's over there." Keanu followed the sheriff's gesture and saw Sarah Cole standing near a pickup truck. Soaked, trembling, her hands clasped together as if in prayer. Her face was pale and desperate. Even from a distance, he could see the kind of fear that only a parent could know. It hit him like a wave. He'd seen that kind of look before, on people clinging to hope in the darkest moments of their lives. "Where was he last seen?" Keanu asked quietly. "Near the old service road behind their farm," the sheriff said. "He ran into the woods after his alarm dog right before the storm hit. We found tracks heading east, but they disappear past the ridge. That area floods first." Keanu nodded, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Then that's where I'll start." The sheriff blinked, almost surprised. "You sure? It's rough terrain out there. We don't want to risk losing another person." Keanu adjusted the hood of his jacket, testing the flashlight in his hand. "I've been in worse places," he said softly. "Just tell me how to reach the trail." The sheriff gave quick directions and added, "Stay on radio channel 3 if you find anything." Keanu gave him a thumbs up, then turned to Sarah. She hadn't noticed him yet. She was too focused on the forest, whispering her son's name over and over. He approached gently, not wanting to startle her. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "I'm going to help look for your boy." She turned toward him, eyes swollen from crying. For a second, she seemed not to recognize him through the rain. "You? Why would you?" "Because it's the right thing to do," Keanu replied. His tone was simple, grounded. "We'll bring him home." Sarah nodded weakly, tears mixing with the rain. "Please. His name's Ethan. He's only 10. He's scared of thunder." Keanu felt his throat tighten. "Then we'll find him fast." He clicked on his flashlight and began walking toward the eastern ridge, boots sinking into the mud. The beam cut through the darkness, catching raindrops that looked like falling sparks. Every sound was muffled except for the wind and the distant calls of other searchers. The deeper he went, the quieter it got. The storm had swallowed the world whole, and yet he kept moving forward, guided only by instinct and the faint hope that somewhere ahead, a child was still holding on. The trail was narrow and slick, with water streaming down its center like a small river. Keanu moved carefully, holding the flashlight low to spot footprints or broken branches. The rain had nearly washed everything away, but years of riding motorcycles and hiking remote areas had sharpened his sense of direction. He knew when something felt off. The forest here felt heavy, charged, alive with danger. Thunder rumbled overhead, close enough to shake the ground. His jacket clung to his shoulders, soaked through, but he barely noticed. His thoughts drifted to the woman's face, Sarah's fear, her trembling hands. He'd met people all over the world, from billionaires to monks, and he'd learned that human pain sounded the same no matter where it came from. Tonight, that pain had a name: Ethan. Keanu stopped near a fallen log where the mud looked disturbed. Kneeling, he ran his fingers along a small indentation. It wasn't a full footprint, but the shape was narrow, too small to be an adult. He aimed his flashlight closer and noticed something red pressed into the mud. He picked it up. It was a torn piece of fabric, soaked but unmistakable. A child's shirt. He radioed softly. "Sheriff, this is Reeves. I think I've got a lead. East Trail. Maybe half a mile past the ridge." Static crackled. Then the sheriff's voice came through. "Copy that, Reeves. Sending a unit your way. Watch for the river crossing, it's close to overflowing." "Understood," Keanu said, slipping the fabric into his pocket. He pressed on, his boots squelching in the mud. The beam of his flashlight bounced off the trees, revealing flashes of white bark and glistening puddles. Each gust of wind carried the faintest echo of a bark, or maybe just his imagination. "Buddy," he muttered under his breath, remembering the dog's name. "If you're out there, make some noise." He stopped again, listening. Nothing but the rain. Then, faintly, just faintly, he heard it. A small bark, weak but real, coming from somewhere down the slope to his left. His pulse quickened. He half ran, half slid down the incline, catching himself against a tree as mud splashed up his legs. The barking came again, followed by a sound that made his heart stop a child's whimper. "Ethan!" he shouted. "Can you hear me?" There was no answer, but the sound had been there. He was close. Lightning lit up the forest for a split second, revealing a small, collapsed wooden structure about 30 yards ahead, an old storage shed, half hidden behind the trees. The roof sagged, one wall missing. It looked like it hadn't been used in years. But inside that flash of light, he'd seen movement. Keanu steadied his breathing, stepping forward through the rain. The wind roared around him, but his mind was calm, focused. He wasn't an actor, not tonight. He was just a man in a storm, trying to save a life. And as he reached the door of the shed, he whispered to himself, "Hang on, kid. I'm here." The rain had turned vicious, pounding against the trees so hard it sounded like gravel striking wood. Lightning tore across the sky, illuminating the search teams scattered through the forest. Dozens of flashlights flickered between the trees, beams slicing through the mist. Voices called out Ethan's name again and again, echoing off the soaked hillsides. Keanu trudged deeper into the woods, every step heavy with mud. The ground sucked at his boots, and the rain blurred his vision. He tightened his grip on the flashlight and swept the beam over the terrain, scanning for any sign of movement. He knew the window for finding the boy safe was shrinking fast. The temperature had dropped sharply. Every minute counted. From his earpiece came the sheriff's voice, half lost to static. "All units be advised. The north side of the ridge is impassable. The river's breaking over the embankment. Stay clear of the low ground." Keanu stopped, looking toward the sound of rushing water. He could hear it even from here, loud and angry. That meant Ethan might be trapped between the flooded side and the ridge. He radioed back, "Copy that, Sheriff. I'll check the east slope near the river path. If the boy tried to follow his dog, that's likely where he went." "Be careful, Keanu. It's bad out there." Keanu gave a quick nod to no one, then kept moving. The wind lashed through the trees, breaking branches that fell dangerously close. The storm had stripped away the night's silence, but under all that noise, he still listened for the sound of a child, a bark, anything. A glint caught his eye near a cluster of low branches. He crouched down, sweeping his flashlight over it. Something red stood out against the mud. Reaching forward, he gently tugged a small baseball cap free from the wet branches. It was soaked, but the logo, a faded superhero emblem, was still visible. It looked like something a 10-year-old would never take off. His pulse quickened. "Ethan," he called softly, his voice steady, despite the storm. "Hey, buddy, it's okay. I'm here to help." No answer. Only the hiss of rain and the boom of thunder in reply. He turned the cap over in his hands for a moment, then tucked it into his jacket pocket. He stood still, eyes sweeping the forest, straining to hear beyond the storm's roar. Then, just barely, he caught at a sound faint and distant, cutting through the wind. A bark. "Buddy?" Keanu called out. He waited, holding his breath. The bark came again, weaker this time, but unmistakable. He started toward it, careful on the slippery ground. Branches clawed at his sleeves as he moved, but he ignored the scratches. The barking came again, guiding him downhill. He slipped once, catching himself on a fallen log slick with rain. His flashlight beam danced wildly, but he kept moving. Somewhere ahead, in the darkness, a frightened child was waiting. Keanu steadied himself on the fallen log, breathing hard. The cold rain ran down his face, dripping from his chin as he aimed the flashlight ahead. The bark had come from somewhere beyond the ridge, maybe near the creek bed. He moved slowly, testing each step before putting his full weight down. The ground had turned into a trap of roots and mud, and one wrong move could send him tumbling. He paused for a moment and listened. Another bark echoed, followed by a faint cry that made the hair rise on the back of his neck. It wasn't a scream, it was softer, like the sound of someone trying to be brave, but failing. "Ethan!" he shouted, his voice cutting through the storm. "It's okay, keep calling out." Silence. Then one more bark, but weaker now, muffled by the distance. Keanu pressed forward, wiping rain from his eyes. He remembered his own childhood moments of fear, times when the world felt too big, too loud, too cold. That feeling was universal. No matter how old you got, it was something you never forgot. The wind gusted again, pushing him sideways. He grabbed onto a tree for balance. Lightning lit the forest for an instant, revealing the steep drop ahead, a slope leading toward the swollen river. The water below was surging, brown and violent, carrying fallen branches and debris. If Ethan was near that riverbank, the situation was dire. He raised his radio again. "Sheriff, it's Reeves. I think I'm closing in. I'm hearing a dog and maybe the boy near the river's edge." The reply came with heavy static. "Copy, but stay clear of the lower ground. The current's too strong, do not cross, Keanu." He didn't answer. The storm was too loud now, and something inside him told him time was running out. He wasn't about to turn back. He followed the faint sound of barking down the slope, using trees to steady himself. Mud splashed up his legs, soaking his jeans. After another few minutes, the trail disappeared completely. Only the sound of rushing water remained. He aimed the flashlight toward the noise, but the rain was so dense that it felt like a wall. Then, through the chaos, he noticed something barely visible, a small movement under a group of leaning trees. He squinted and stepped closer. It was a shape low to the ground, trembling. His heart kicked. "Buddy?" he called. The golden retriever barked weakly in response, the sound breaking with exhaustion. The dog was there, but where was the boy? Keanu crouched down, reaching toward the animal. Buddy wagged his tail once, then looked back into the darkness behind him. Keanu followed the dog's gaze toward the old shed, half buried in mud and leaning against a rock. The door was barely hanging on. "Good boy," Keanu murmured, patting the dog's head. "Show me." Buddy whined and scratched at the door. Keanu lifted his flashlight, the beam trembling as he stepped closer. The sound of the river thundered behind him, but his focus was locked on that small shed. Somewhere inside, a bell, faint sound, like breathing, answered. Keanu's pulse quickened as he approached the shed. The door creaked in the wind, slamming against its hinges with every gust. The roof sagged under the pounding rain, and the air smelled of wet wood and decay. He knelt beside Buddy, who was whining, his paws scratching at the splintered wood. "Easy, boy," Keanu whispered. "We're gonna get him out." He tried the handle, but the door barely moved. It was wedged shut with mud and debris. He pushed harder, shoulder braced against it, until it gave with a heavy crack. The flashlight beam swept through the gloom. The floor was soaked, littered with broken boards and rusted tools. In the corner, huddled beneath a torn tarp, was a small figure. "Ethan," Keanu said softly, crouching down. The boy's eyes fluttered open at the sound of his name. His lips were pale, his clothes clinging to his small frame. He was holding Buddy's leash wrapped tightly around his wrist, his knuckles white from gripping it. "Hey," Keanu continued gently, kneeling beside him. "You did good, kid. You kept him safe." Ethan's voice was barely a whisper. "I didn't want him to get wet." He was shaking. His teeth chattered as he spoke. Are you really him?" Keanu smiled faintly, brushing mud from the boy's hair. "Doesn't matter who I am right now. We're getting you home." The boy blinked at him, dazed, his small body trembling from the cold. Buddy crawled closer and pressed against Ethan's side, tail wagging weakly. Keanu reached into his jacket and wrapped it around both of them. "That's it," he murmured. "Keep close to him. We'll get warm soon." He tapped the radio, trying to reach the sheriff. "Reeves here. I've got him. He's alive, but cold. We're about half a mile east of the river. Need medical help and a stretcher." The radio crackled faintly, but the storm drowned out the response. Keanu frowned, glancing toward the river. Outside, the water had risen even higher, the current pulling at fallen branches like claws. If they waited too long, the shed could collapse, or worse, flood. "We've got to move now, okay?" Ethan nodded weakly. "I can walk." Keanu shook his head gently. "Let's not take that risk." He slipped one arm under the boy's knees and another around his back, lifting him carefully. Ethan's head rested against his shoulder, and Buddy trotted beside them, barking once as if to lead the way. Keanu took a deep breath and stepped into the storm again. The rain hit him full force, cold and relentless. The mud was slippery, the wind fierce, but he moved steadily, step by step, keeping Ethan close, and the flashlight aimed ahead. Behind them, lightning struck a tree, splitting it in half with a deafening crack. The forest lit up like a battlefield. then fell dark again. Keanu didn't look back. He just tightened his grip on the boy and whispered to himself, "Hang on, kid. We're not done yet." The rain had not stopped for a single moment. It fell in thick, slanting sheets, turning the field near the sheriff's truck into a swamp of mud and standing water. The air smelled of wet earth and gasoline from the search vehicles. Sarah Cole stood there, her clothes plastered to her body, her hair tangled and dripping, her lips trembling uncontrollably. She didn't feel the cold anymore, just the hollow ache in her chest that grew with every minute her son was gone. A volunteer wrapped a blanket around her shoulders, but she hardly noticed. Her eyes were fixed on the tree line, black and endless under the lightning flashes. Every time a flashlight beam flickered between the trees, her heart skipped, thinking maybe, just maybe, it was Ethan. But each time, the beam vanished, replaced by more darkness. "Mrs. Cole," the sheriff said gently, stepping closer, "we've got half the team covering the East Ridge. The others are working the lower trail near the river. We'll find him." She looked at him, eyes wide and unfocused. "You don't understand," she whispered. "He's just a little boy. He doesn't know how to handle this kind of storm." The sheriff nodded. "We're doing everything we can." Sarah pressed a hand to her chest, trying to keep herself upright. Her body felt weightless, like she might collapse at any moment. "He's afraid of thunder," she said softly. "He always covers his ears when it's loud. I should have gone after him sooner." Her voice cracked, and she turned away, clutching the blanket tighter. The sheriff hesitated, wanting to comfort her, but knowing there were no words that could ease that kind of fear. He gave her space, turning back to his radio to check for updates. The static-filled voices offered little comfort, just weather alerts and coordinates. Sarah sank onto the tailgate of a nearby truck, burying her face in her hands. The storm blurred everything, even the tears on her cheeks. Memories flooded her mind like snapshots. Ethan laughing at breakfast, Ethan running barefoot through the fields, Ethan's small arms hugging her goodnight. She whispered into the rain, "Please, God, just bring him home. I don't care how, just bring him back." Her hands trembled as she pulled something from her coat pocket. It was a small photograph, Ethan with Buddy, taken last spring in the backyard. They were both smiling, sunlight in their eyes, the dog's tongue hanging out as if laughing too. That photo was her anchor, her proof that joy still existed. Now it felt like a piece of another life. Behind her, volunteers gathered in quiet groups, checking maps and flashlights. Some looked at her with pity, others with determination. Every single one of them knew that look in her eyes, the look of a mother holding on to hope by a thread. She didn't know that somewhere deep in the woods, a man she'd never met had already found her son and was carrying him toward that very hope. Sarah sat motionless for several minutes, her mind drifting somewhere between prayer and panic. The storm made time feel distorted. Minutes felt like hours, and every flash of lightning seemed to hold its breath before crashing down again. Somewhere inside, she could feel herself breaking, but she refused to let go completely. Mothers don't stop hoping, not until there's nothing left to hope for. She pulled the blanket tighter, the smell of damp wool mixing with the scent of rain and diesel. Around her, the volunteers were organizing, their voices faint under the roar of the storm. She could see their flashlights bobbing as they prepared to head back into the woods. Each beam represented another chance, another small piece of hope. A young deputy approached her, holding a thermos. "Ma'am," he said softly, "you should drink something warm. We need you to keep your strength up." She shook her head. "I can't. Please," he insisted. "Even a sip." Sarah took the thermos with trembling hands and lifted it to her lips. The coffee was bitter and lukewarm, but it grounded her for a moment. "Thank you," she murmured. He gave her a small nod, then adjusted his raincoat and hurried off toward the search teams. She watched him go, silently willing him to be the one who found Ethan. Her eyes drifted again toward the woods. Every gust of wind made the trees sway like restless spirits. She thought of Ethan's small hands gripping Buddy's leash, the way he'd kissed the dog's head before bed, whispering, "Good night, best friend." She could picture his sneakers by the door and his red baseball cap that he refused to take off. Even at dinner, the memory stabbed at her chest. The storm had changed everything so quickly. Just an hour ago, she had been setting the table, humming to the radio while waiting for her son to come inside. She'd planned to watch their favorite movie after dinner, just the two of them, and Buddy curled up on the couch. Now, that small, ordinary joy felt like a dream she might never return to. One of the volunteers returned briefly. Mud streaked across his face. "We found the dog's paw prints heading east," he told the sheriff. "They're faint, but it's something." Sarah bolted upright, her eyes wide. "You found Buddy's tracks? Where?" The sheriff turned toward her quickly. "It's not confirmed yet. They're sending a few men to follow them." She stepped forward, desperate. "Please, let me go with them." He shook his head firmly. "No, ma'am. It's too dangerous. The current's rising fast." Tears spilled down her cheeks, though the rain made them impossible to tell apart. "That's my son out there," she whispered. "I know," the sheriff said softly, his voice cracking for the first time that night. "And that's why we'll bring him back." She stood still as he turned away, her heart pounding against the silence between thunderclaps. Somewhere out there, Ethan was fighting the storm, and she could only wait. The minutes crawled by with agonizing slowness. The search teams had vanished into the forest, their flashlights swallowed by rain and darkness. The sheriff's radio crackled now and then, but most of what came through was static. Sarah stood by the tailgate, clutching the photograph of Ethan so tightly the edges bent under her fingers. The wind tore at her blanket, but she didn't care. She was afraid to move, afraid that if she stopped looking at the woods, the hope inside her might disappear completely. Another volunteer came running from the far side of the field. "Sheriff!" he shouted. "We found a red cap about a mile out. Looks like it belongs to a kid." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. "Ethan's hat," she whispered. "It has to be." The sheriff nodded, his face grim but careful. "That's a good sign," he said into his radio. "They're close. Keep searching east of the river bend." Sarah turned toward him, tears mixing with rain. "If they found his hat, that means he's alive, right?" The sheriff hesitated, then forced a gentle smile. "We take every sign as hope, ma'am." She pressed her hands together, whispering another prayer. "Please, Lord, guide them to him." For the first time that night, she closed her eyes and let herself remember not the storm, not the fear, but the life she had built for Ethan. She saw the small diner where she worked double shifts 6 days a week, saving every dollar for his school clothes. She remembered him sitting in the corner booth after class, drawing superheroes on napkins while she refilled coffee cups for truck drivers. He always waited for her, no matter how late her shift ended. When the bell over the door jingled at closing time, he'd run to her with that same bright grin that made every hardship worth it. When his father had walked out 2 years earlier, the silence in the house had been unbearable. She'd cried in the laundry room so Ethan wouldn't hear. Then, one spring morning, a friend at the diner had handed her a small golden retriever puppy. "He'll give that boy a reason to smile again," she'd said. And she was right. Buddy had filled their home with life again. The dog became Ethan's shadow, his guardian, his laughter, his peace. Now, that little family of 3 was fractured by a single storm. The sheriff's voice came over the radio again, louder this time. "Units report visibility near zero by the river. Floodwaters rising fast. We're losing ground." Sarah's knees weakened. She leaned against the truck, gripping the cold metal for balance. Her heart raced with terror. She looked at the woods once more and screamed her son's name with every ounce of strength she had left. "Ethan! Baby, please answer me!" Her voice echoed, carried away by the wind. But in that same moment, far beyond the ridge, another voice answered in silence, a man's quiet promise carried through the storm. "I'll find him," Keanu whispered. "I swear I will." The storm had swallowed the world. The sound of wind against the trees roared like the ocean, and every crash of thunder felt closer than the one before. Inside the small, collapsing shed, Ethan huddled against the wall, his knees pulled tightly to his chest. The air smelled of wet dirt, rust, and mold. His flashlight had died long ago, and the darkness now pressed against him from every direction. Beside him, Buddy whimpered. The golden retriever's fur was soaked and matted, his body trembling uncontrollably. Ethan reached out, feeling for him in the dark, and pulled the dog close. "It's okay, Buddy," he whispered through chattering teeth. "I'll keep you warm." He shrugged off his small red jacket and wrapped it around the dog, tucking the edges beneath Buddy's belly. His own arms were left bare to the freezing air, but he didn't care. The dog's breathing steadied a little, the warmth of the fabric comforting both of them. A drop of water fell from the leaking roof, splashing against Ethan's cheek. He wiped it away, unsure if it was rain or another tear. The floor beneath him was cold and slick, and his legs were starting to go numb. He tried to remember how long he'd been out there. Hours, maybe. The storm made time disappear. He buried his face against Buddy's neck, inhaling the familiar scent of his fur. It reminded him of home of mornings when Buddy would jump onto his bed, wagging his tail and licking his face until he laughed. Of afternoons in the field, when they'd race until neither of them could breathe. Of the nights when Buddy would curl up beside him, guarding him as he fell asleep. "I'm sorry," Ethan whispered, his voice cracking. "I shouldn't have chased you. Mom told me to come inside." Buddy gave a small whine, pressing his nose against Ethan's chin. The sound of it broke something inside the boy. He felt helpless, small, and scared, the kind of fear that made your chest tighten until it hurt to breathe. He closed his eyes, remembering his mother's voice. She used to tell him bedtime stories about angels, how sometimes they didn't have wings or halos, how they looked like ordinary people but showed up when you needed them most. "Guardian angels don't always shine," she would say. "Sometimes they just show up quietly." Now, shivering in the dark, Ethan whispered into the storm, "If there's one out there, please help us." Outside, thunder cracked like the sky was breaking in half. The light that followed poured through the gaps in the shed's walls, for a brief moment revealing the world beyond. The trees bent sideways, branches falling, the rain slashing the ground in rivers. And in that flash, a shadow moved between the trees. Ethan froze. His breath caught in his throat as the lightning faded, plunging the woods back into pitch-black darkness. He could still hear the rain hammering the roof, but beneath that sound, something else stirred footsteps, soft at first, then louder, crunching against the soaked ground outside the shed. Buddy's ears perked up, his body tensing. A low growl rumbled in his chest. Ethan pressed a hand to the dog's back. "Shh, it's okay," he whispered, though his voice trembled. He wasn't sure if he was trying to calm Buddy or himself. He held his breath and listened. The footsteps came closer, then stopped. For a long moment, there was only the sound of the storm. Ethan's heart pounded so loud he could hear it echo in his ears. He thought of his mother again, how she'd told him that angels never knocked, that sometimes help came quietly when you least expected it. But what if it wasn't an angel? What if it was something else? His imagination began to spiral. The woods were filled with shadows, and to a scared 10-year-old, shadows could be anything. Buddy suddenly barked, loud and sharp, his voice echoing through the storm. The sound startled Ethan, but it also gave him courage. He crawled to the small opening in the shed's wall and peered out. He could barely see past the rain, just the faint outline of trees twisting in the wind. Then another flash of lightning split the sky, and for the briefest second, Ethan saw something that made him gasp. A figure, tall and dark, moving slowly between the trees, carrying something that glowed faintly in the stormlight. A flashlight. Ethan's hope flickered like that distant beam. "Hey!" he called, his voice small but desperate. "Over here!" The thunder swallowed his words, and he wasn't sure if anyone had heard. He shouted again, louder this time. "Help! Please!" Buddy barked again, his tail thumping weakly against the ground. The sound of movement came closer, faster now. Ethan could hear someone's voice cutting through the wind, deep, calm, steady. "Ethan, can you hear me?" The boy's eyes widened. "Yes, I'm here." "We're in the shed." He felt tears of relief flood his eyes. The voice was real. Someone had found them. Buddy wagged his tail furiously now, barking again and again as if to guide the stranger. The beam of the flashlight appeared near the door, flickering across the boards. Ethan backed up, holding Buddy close. The door creaked once, twice, then burst open, banging hard against the wall. The sudden rush of light blinded him. For a second, he saw only a silhouette, framed by rain and wind. Then a calm voice broke through the chaos. "Hey," it said softly, "you're safe now." Ethan blinked through the tears. "You came." The figure stepped forward, kneeling down beside him. "Of course I did." Outside, the storm raged on, but inside that small shed, hope had found its way in. For a moment, Ethan couldn't speak. He just stared at the man in the doorway, light spilling around him like a halo. The wind howled behind Keanu, blowing rain and leaves into the tiny shed. His face was streaked with mud, his hair soaked, but his voice was steady, calm, the kind. A voice that made you believe everything might be okay. "You're Ethan, right?" Keanu said gently, kneeling to the boy's level. "Your mom's been looking everywhere for you." Ethan nodded slowly, his eyes wide. She's okay?" "She's safe," Keanu said, giving him a reassuring smile. "And she's waiting for you. But we need to get you both out of this storm." Buddy barked once, tail wagging despite the cold. Keanu reached out and scratched behind his ears. "You're a brave one, huh?" he murmured, then looked back at Ethan. "He kept you warm?" Ethan nodded again, voice trembling. "He was scared, but I told him we'd be okay." Keanu looked around the collapsing shed. Water was seeping in from every corner, the structure creaking with each gust of wind. "You did good," he said. "But we can't stay here." Ethan tried to stand, but his legs gave out, trembling from exhaustion. Keanu caught him before he fell, wrapping his jacket tighter around the boy's shoulders. "It's all right. I've got you." The boy looked up at him, his voice small. "Are you really Keanu Reeves?" Keanu smiled faintly, brushing rain from Ethan's forehead. "Yeah, but tonight, I'm just the guy who's gonna take you home." Ethan managed a weak smile, clinging to his rescuer's arm as Keanu lifted him. The boy's small hands gripped tightly around his neck, and Buddy followed close behind, splashing through the mud. Outside, the rain fell harder than ever. Keanu could feel the ground shifting under his boots, the current from the overflowing river cutting across the trail. Every step was a battle against the storm, but he kept moving, his breathing slow and measured. Ethan's weight was light, but the responsibility felt heavy in his chest. Thunder cracked overhead, and Buddy barked in alarm. Keanu stopped, scanning the trees ahead. The forest was pitch black, except for the thin cone of light from his flashlight. For a brief moment, he closed his eyes, centering himself. He had no map, no clear path, only instinct and the promise he'd made to a mother he hadn't met. "It's okay," he said softly, to both the boy and the dog. "We're almost there." Ethan's head rested on his shoulder, his breathing shallow but steady. Keanu tightened his grip and pushed forward. Each step carried him closer to safety, through the rain, through the darkness, through the relentless noise of the storm that seemed to test his every move. Somewhere behind him, the shed finally gave way, collapsing with a dull, distant crash. Keanu didn't look back. He didn't need to. The storm had taken enough tonight, and he wasn't about to let it take anything more. The rain had eased only slightly, but the wind still tore through the trees like a warning. The beam of Keanu's flashlight cut through the gloom, glinting off raindrops that hung in the air like shards of glass. His boots sank deep into the mud as he followed the faint trail along the river bend. Each step splashed cold water against his legs, but he barely noticed. He was focused on the small paw prints that dotted the path ahead. They were fresh pressed, deep into the wet ground. He knelt, steadying himself against a fallen branch. The prints led toward the base of a collapsed shed barely visible through the trees. The wind whipped against his back, nearly knocking him off balance. He squinted, shielding his eyes from the rain as he aimed his flashlight toward the shape ahead. The shed leaned dangerously to one side, half buried under debris from the storm. "Buddy?" he called, his voice steady but urgent. For a few moments, there was only the sound of wind and rushing water. Then, faintly, a small bark echoed back. It was weak, trembling, but it was there. Keanu's heart kicked hard in his chest. "Hang on, I'm coming," he said, pushing forward through the underbrush. As he approached the shed, the beam of his car phone's light caught on movement a flash of golden fur, a tail flicking weakly. The dog's whimper pierced through the rain, desperate and frightened. Keanu crouched low beside the collapsed door, gripping the edge of the wood. It was wedged tight, the frame swollen from water. He braced himself and pulled, his muscles straining as the wood groaned. "Come on," he muttered, his breath visible in the cold air. The door resisted, then finally cracked free with a sharp sound. It swung open, revealing the dark interior of the shed. The smell of wet earth and decay hit him, mixed with something faint and human, a child's shallow breathing. "Hey," Keanu said softly, lowering the light. "It's okay. I'm here." The beam illuminated Ethan huddled in the far corner, his arms wrapped protectively around Buddy. The boy's face was pale, streaked with dirt and rain, his eyes wide and dazed. He blinked at the sudden light, then squinted as Keanu stepped closer. Hey, it's all right," Keanu said again, kneeling beside him. "You're safe now." Ethan tried to speak, but his voice was faint. "Buddy, he was cold." Keanu nodded, smiling faintly. "You did good, kid. You kept him warm." The boy blinked, trying to focus. His lips moved again, struggling to form the words. Are you John Wick?" Keanu couldn't help but chuckle softly, shaking his head. "Not tonight, kid," he said, wrapping his coat around the boy. "Just Keanu." The storm raged outside, but in that small broken shed something shifted. Hope had found a foothold. Ethan blinked slowly, his small fingers clutching the fabric of Keanu's jacket as if afraid it might vanish. His lips trembled from the cold, and every breath came out in a shudder. Buddy shifted beside him, resting his head on the boy's lap. The dog's eyes half closed, exhausted but still alert enough to sense that help had finally come. Keanu placed a hand on the boy's shoulder, his voice calm but firm. "You're freezing," he said. "We need to get you both somewhere warm." The boy nodded weakly, his teeth chattering. "I tried to find the house," he whispered. But everything looked the same. The trees? They moved. "It's okay," Keanu said softly. "You did your best. You stayed put, that's what saved you." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small thermal blanket from his emergency kit, unfolding it and wrapping it tightly around Ethan's shoulders. The metallic material reflected the dim beam of the flashlight, casting a faint glow across their faces. Ethan leaned into him without hesitation, the trust of a child replacing his earlier fear. "My mom," he murmured. "She must be so scared." "She's safe," Keanu reassured. "She's waiting for you. We're gonna get you back to her." Buddy whimpered softly, as if in agreement. Keanu stroked the dog's fur, feeling the tremble slowly fade beneath his touch. "Good boy," he said quietly. "You did your job." A loud crack split the air outside as another tree fell somewhere nearby. The shed groaned in response, one of its support beams shifting dangerously. Keanu looked up, gauging how long they had. Not long. The storm was loosening everything. If they stayed, the structure might collapse completely. "All right," he said, tightening the blanket around Ethan. "We're leaving now." Ethan's eyes widened. "But it's raining so hard." "I know," Keanu replied, crouching down to meet his gaze. "But I'll carry you. You hold on to me, and don't let go. I won't let the storm take you." The boy nodded, his face pale but determined. Keanu slipped one arm beneath his legs and the other around his back, lifting him gently. Ethan's head fell against his shoulder, and his small hands gripped the collar of Keanu's coat. Buddy trotted beside them, tail low, sticking close to Keanu's boots. Stepping outside, Keanu was hit by the full force of the wind. Rain pelted his face and ran down his neck, cold and relentless. He adjusted his grip and started moving carefully up the slope. The mud was slick and deep, and more than once he slipped, but he caught himself each time before falling. His boots sank with every step, the suction of wet earth pulling at him, but he refused to slow down. Behind them, the shed creaked once more, then collapsed completely with a hollow crash. Ethan jumped at the sound, and Keanu held him tighter. "Don't look back," he said quietly. "We're almost there." The rain beat down in steady sheets as Keanu climbed the ridge, each breath coming in slow, controlled bursts. Ethan's small arms were wrapped tightly around his neck, his head tucked beneath Keanu's chin. Buddy stayed close to his boots, his fur slick and heavy from the downpour, but the dog refused to slow down. Every few steps he looked back to make sure they were still following him, as if guiding them home. Lightning flashed across the sky, lighting the path for only a heartbeat before darkness returned. Keanu used those fleeting moments to scan ahead, marking the trees and fallen logs in his mind. He was no stranger to exhaustion, but this was different. This was survival, not performance. His muscles ached, his legs burned, and still, he kept moving. "Are we close?" Ethan asked softly, his voice muffled by the wind. "Almost," Keanu said. "You see that light up there?" Ethan lifted his head slightly, blinking through the rain. In the far distance, faint beams of flashlights flickered like fireflies between the trees. "Search teams." "Yeah," the boy whispered. "That's where we're going," Keanu said, gripping him tighter. "Hold on to me, okay?" "I'm not scared anymore," Ethan murmured. Keanu smiled faintly, though the boy couldn't see it. "Good, you've been brave this whole time." The slope grew steeper, and mud slid under his boots with each step. At one point, he lost his footing and stumbled, dropping to one knee. He held Ethan tighter to keep him from hitting the ground. "You okay?" he asked quickly. Ethan nodded. "You didn't let go." "Not planning to," Keanu said, forcing himself up again. His breath came heavy now, each inhale sharp from the cold. But ahead, the voices were getting louder. The flashlights were moving closer. Buddy barked suddenly, tail wagging despite his exhaustion. Keanu looked up and saw two volunteers emerging from the tree line. One of them shouted, "Over here! We've got movement!" The men ran toward them, splashing through the waterlogged ground. "We found him!" Keanu called out, his voice barely audible over the storm. "He's okay." The rescuers reached them, one of them quickly wrapping a dry blanket around Ethan while the other radioed the sheriff. "Copy that. We've got the boy." Sarah's voice could be heard faintly over the static, breaking with relief. Keanu exhaled for the first time in what felt like hours. He gently set Ethan down, steadying him as paramedics approached from behind. The boy turned to him, shivering but smiling. "You came for me," he said. Keanu brushed a wet strand of hair from the boy's forehead and nodded. "Everyone deserves to be found, kid." The volunteers helped Ethan onto a stretcher, Buddy refusing to leave his side. Keanu stood for a moment, watching them disappear through the trees, toward the lights of the sheriff's truck. The storm was still raging, but inside him, there was only quiet. The rain was merciless. Sheets of water pounded the forest, blurring everything into gray streaks. Keanu tightened his grip on Ethan, wrapping him securely in his jacket. The boy's small hands clung to him like lifelines, his body trembling from the cold. Buddy stayed close, splashing through the mud, refusing to leave his side. The path ahead was nearly gone. Where there had once been dirt and leaves, now there was only mud and moving water. The river had overflowed, turning the forest floor into a maze of puddles and streams. Keanu paused for a moment, scanning the darkness with his flashlight, searching for any safe route forward. The beam flickered, weakened by the storm, but it was enough to catch a glimpse of higher ground to the east. "That way," he murmured to himself. "We can make it." Ethan's head rested against his chest, his voice barely a whisper. "Don't let go." Keanu looked down at him, his expression soft but firm. "I won't," he said. "You're going home tonight." He shifted his stance and started moving again, one careful step at a time. The mud was knee-deep in places, sucking at his boots, trying to drag him down. Every step felt heavier than the last. The wind howled through the trees, carrying the sharp scent of pine and wet bark. A branch snapped overhead and crashed down just a few feet away, sending water and debris flying. Keanu ducked instinctively, shielding Ethan with his body. The impact shook the ground, but he didn't stop. He just took a steady breath and kept going. Buddy barked behind him, his paws slipping but never stopping. The dog's loyalty was unbreakable, his small body pushing through the storm with fierce determination. Lightning flashed across the sky, illuminating the flooded forest in stark white light. For an instant, everything was still. Keanu's figure moving through the storm, the boy clinging to him, the dog trailing close. Then, the thunder cracked, echoing across the valley. "Hang on, Ethan," Keanu said, his breath coming in short bursts. "We're almost through." The boy stirred, his eyelids fluttering. "It's so cold." "I know," Keanu said, shifting the boy higher in his arms. "But you're strong. Just a little longer." The water rose again as they neared the river crossing. The current was swift, dark, and angry. Keanu hesitated, calculating the risk. There was no bridge left, only fallen branches and debris, forming a rough, unstable path across the torrent. He looked down at the boy, then at the dog, who stood trembling at the edge but ready to follow. "All right," Keanu said under his breath. "We're doing this together." He stepped into the current, the icy water rushing past his knees, threatening to knock him off balance. The force nearly took him under, but he dug his heels in and kept moving. Ethan's small arms tightened around his neck, and Buddy barked from behind, leaping into the water after them. The storm showed no mercy, but neither did Keanu's resolve. The current pressed against Keanu's legs with brutal strength, dragging debris and fallen leaves with it. Every step through the flooded path felt like pushing against a wall. He leaned forward, his body shielding Ethan from the wind. The boy's head rested against his shoulder, his breath shallow but steady. Keanu's arms ached, but he refused to loosen his grip. Buddy paddled beside him, the golden retriever's fur slicked flat against his body. Every few seconds, Buddy looked back, his eyes glowing faintly in the light of Keanu's flashlight. The dog's courage fueled him, a small reminder of what they were fighting for: life, family, hope. Halfway across, a surge of water slammed into Keanu's knees, almost taking him down. He stumbled, catching himself on a submerged log. Ethan whimpered softly, and Keanu steadied him quickly. "You're all right, buddy," he said, his voice calm despite the chaos. "I've got you." The cold was biting deep now, numbing his fingers, his face, his legs. But the thought of Sarah waiting, praying by the sheriff's truck, kept him moving. He could almost hear her voice in the storm, calling her son's name. That image alone was enough to make him fight harder. He waded through the final stretch of water, stepping carefully onto firmer ground. His boots sank deep into the mud, but the current eased behind them. He could still hear the river roaring, angry and relentless, but they had crossed. Ethan lifted his head slightly. "We made it?" "Almost," Keanu said, brushing the boy's wet hair back from his face. "The hardest part's behind us." Buddy climbed out of the water, shaking himself violently and spraying droplets everywhere. Keanu smiled faintly at the sight. "You did good, boy," he murmured. They started uphill toward the open field where the search teams had gathered. The path was uneven and slick, but the faint glow of flashlights flickered ahead like tiny stars. Rescue was close. Another crack of thunder rolled across the sky, followed by a blinding flash. For a brief second, the trees ahead were lit up, and so was the trail of footprints behind him. He didn't stop to admire the sight. His muscles screamed with exhaustion, his body moving purely on instinct now. "Keanu." Ethan's small voice came again, barely audible through the storm. "Yeah? Thank you." Keanu adjusted his hold on him, tightening the blanket around the boy's shoulders. "You don't have to thank me," he said softly. "You just hang on." A sudden gust of wind sent another branch crashing down nearby. Keanu ducked low, turning his body to shield Ethan from the flying debris. The branch shattered against a rock, spraying splinters, but neither of them was hit. He straightened slowly, his breathing rough but controlled. "Almost there," he muttered, his voice a promise as much as reassurance. The faint voices ahead grew. Louder now, rescuers calling out, flashlights swinging through the darkness. They were close enough to hear him if he shouted. He took a deep breath and yelled, "Over here!" The lights froze, then began moving toward him fast. Voices rose above the rain as flashlights cut through the misty dark. The shapes of rescuers came into view, running toward the sound of Keanu's call. Their boots splashed through the mud, their dogs barking with excitement. Relief surged through Keanu's chest as he staggered toward them, Ethan still held tightly in his arms. The first volunteer to reach him shouted, "We've got them! He's here!" and waved the others over. Two men rushed forward with blankets, while another bent down to check the trail behind him. "Holy hell," one of them breathed. "You carried them through that?" Keanu didn't answer right away. He just adjusted Ethan's blanket, making sure the boy's face stayed covered from the rain. "He's cold," Keanu said evenly. "He needs warmth fast." A medic nodded quickly, stepping up to check the boy's pulse. "He's alive. Weak, but strong heartbeat." Buddy barked once and wagged his tail, standing proudly next to Keanu. One of the volunteers laughed softly, petting the soaked golden retriever. "And you, little guy, you're a hero too." Ethan's eyelids fluttered open. The sudden brightness of the flashlights made him squint, but when he saw the people around him, his lips curved into the faintest smile. "We're home?" "Almost," Keanu said quietly, kneeling so the medics could take him. "You're safe now." The medic reached out, but Ethan's hand shot forward, gripping Keanu's wrist. "Don't leave," he whispered. Keanu met his gaze and nodded. "I'm right here. You're gonna see your mom soon." The rescuers spread out, forming a protective circle as they helped Keanu and Ethan back up the slope toward the clearing. The path was treacherous, slippery, with mud. But Keanu kept steady, his hand on Ethan's shoulder, even after the medics took his weight. Buddy stayed beside them, never more than a few inches away. When they reached the top, floodlights from the sheriff's trucks glowed through the rain like beacons. The sheriff himself ran forward, his voice tight with urgency. "We've got them! Sarah, he's safe!" Sarah turned at the sound. For a heartbeat, she froze her mind, struggling to believe what she saw. Then she broke into a run, stumbling through the mud, calling her son's name. "Ethan! Oh my God, Ethan!" Ethan's face lit up at the sound of her voice. "Mom!" Keanu stepped aside as Sarah threw her arms around her son, her sobs lost in the wind. She cradled his face, kissing his forehead again and again. "I thought I lost you," she cried. The boy pointed weakly toward Keanu. "He found me, Mom. He saved me." Sarah turned to Keanu, her eyes full of disbelief and gratitude. For a second, words failed her. You brought him back." Keanu shook his head softly. "He never gave up. He kept his dog warm. He stayed strong. He's the real fighter." Sarah wiped her tears and whispered, "Thank you." Keanu's smile was tired but genuine. "Just glad I was on the right road tonight." The storm finally began to ease as the rescue convoy made its way back toward town. The wind still howled through the trees, but the rain had softened into a cold drizzle that clung to everything it touched. The headlights of the sheriff's trucks carved through the mist, illuminating the muddy trail. In the back seat of one of the vehicles, Ethan lay wrapped in thick blankets, his cheeks flushed from warmth, returning to his skin. Buddy rested beside him, curled up and asleep, his tail twitching every now and then as if dreaming of home. Keanu sat quietly in the passenger seat, his jacket still damp, his hands clasped together to stop the tremor from exhaustion. The adrenaline that had carried him through the storm was fading, replaced by bone-deep fatigue. But he couldn't stop glancing back every few seconds to check on Ethan. The boy's breathing was steady now, his small fingers resting on Buddy's fur. That was enough to make every freezing step worth it. At the front of the convoy, the sheriff's radio buzzed with chatter from dispatch. "Command to Unit 1, confirm status." "Unit 1 to command," the sheriff replied, his tone calm but edged with relief. "We've got the boy and his dog, both alive, returning to base now." A wave of applause and cheers echoed faintly over the radio. Keanu smiled faintly, turning his gaze toward the faint lights appearing through the trees ahead. The town was still dark from the power outage, but the glow of generator lamps around the fire station shone like a promise. As they pulled into the clearing, the crowd of volunteers that had waited all night rushed forward, their faces pale from cold and exhaustion but lit with hope. When the back door opened, a collective gasp filled the air. Sarah was already running before anyone could stop her. Her boots splashed through the mud as she cried her son's name, her voice breaking from hours of fear and prayer. "Ethan!" she screamed, her voice trembling. "Baby, I'm here!" Ethan stirred at the sound, his eyes fluttering open. "Mom?" he whispered. Keanu stepped out of the vehicle and gently lifted the boy into his arms one last time. His muscles ached, but he didn't falter. He carried Ethan forward through the rain as Sarah met him halfway. For a brief second, the world stood still. The storm, the chaos, the exhaustion, it all faded. Sarah fell to her knees, reaching for her son. "Oh my God," she sobbed, pulling him close. "You're safe. You're safe." Ethan wrapped his arms weakly around her neck, tears spilling down his cheeks. "Buddy's okay too, Mom. He stayed with me." Sarah glanced past him and saw Buddy limping, slightly, wagging his tail. The dog's fur was still damp, but his eyes were bright with life. She reached out with her free hand to pet him. "Good boy," she whispered. "You're our hero too." Keanu stood beside them, breathing hard, water dripping from his hair. For the first time that night, he allowed himself to relax. Sarah looked up at Keanu, her face streaked with tears and rain. The lights from the rescue trucks reflected in her eyes, making them glimmer with gratitude and disbelief. She held Ethan close, unable to stop sobbing. "Thank you," she managed, her voice breaking. "You saved my baby." Keanu shook his head softly, his expression calm, almost humble. "He saved his dog," he said quietly. "I just followed the bark." The sheriff stood nearby, his soaked hat in his hands. He gave Keanu a long look, the kind of look shared between men who had both seen too much that night, and nodded once in silent respect. Around them, volunteers watched in awe. Some whispered his name under their breath, realizing who he was. But Keanu didn't want the attention. He stepped back slightly, letting Sarah have her moment with her son. Paramedics moved in gently, checking Ethan's temperature and pulse. They wrapped him in a dry thermal blanket and carried him toward the ambulance. Buddy barked once, refusing to be left behind. The medic smiled and said, "All right, hero, you can come too." The dog hopped into the vehicle, curling up at Ethan's feet like he belonged there. Sarah turned to Keanu again. "I don't even know what to say," she whispered. "I prayed someone would find him, but I never imagined." Keanu gave a small smile. "You don't have to say anything. Just get warm, both of you." The sheriff placed a hand on Keanu's shoulder. "You should get checked out too. You're soaked through." "I'm fine," Keanu replied simply. "I'll rest later." Sarah hesitated, still holding his gaze. "You'll come by the hospital, won't you? He'll want to see you." He nodded slowly. "Yeah, I'll stop by." As the ambulance doors closed, Ethan looked out the window, his small hand pressing against the glass. "Bye, Keanu," he said faintly, his voice barely audible through the rain. Keanu lifted a hand in return. "See you soon, kid." The siren wailed as the ambulance pulled away, heading toward the glowing lights of the county hospital. For the first time in hours, the forest felt still again. The storm had spent its fury, leaving behind only drizzle and mist. The smell of wet pine filled the air. The sheriff exhaled slowly and turned to Keanu. "You know, most folks would have kept driving in weather like that." Keanu gave a tired smile. "Most folks don't hear a mother screaming for her child and keep going." The sheriff nodded. "Well, I'll tell you this much. You picked the right night to take the long way home." Keanu chuckled softly, glancing back toward the dark forest one last time. "Maybe the long way's where you're meant to be sometimes." The volunteers began packing up their gear, the sound of radios fading. Keanu walked toward his car, his boots heavy with mud, but his heart lighter than it had been in a long time. The storm was ending, and somewhere down that road, a boy was safe in his mother's arms again. The sterile glow of hospital lights replaced the flickering flashlights of the storm. Rain still tapped softly against the tall windows, but inside, warmth and quiet filled the small-town emergency ward. Sarah sat beside Ethan's bed, her eyes swollen from crying, but her heart finally steady. Her son's face was pale, a few scratches marking his cheeks, but his chest rose and fell with a strong, steady rhythm. Buddy lay curled up on a blanket near the foot of the bed, snoring softly, his golden fur finally dry. A doctor in a white coat stood by the bedside, checking the boy's pulse. "He's stable now," the doctor said gently, turning to Sarah. "Mild hypothermia and a few bruises, but he's going to be just fine. If he'd stayed out there another hour, though, it could have been much worse." Sarah's breath caught. She reached out and brushed a strand of hair from Ethan's forehead. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. The doctor smiled softly. "You can thank the man who brought him in. Without him, this story could have ended differently." Sarah's gaze drifted toward the door. Through the small window, she could see Keanu standing in the hallway, still wearing his soaked clothes. His hair clung to his temples, and his jacket hung heavy from the rain, but his posture was calm, quiet, as if exhaustion had finally caught up to him. He held a paper cup of coffee from the vending machine, the steam curling around his face in the dim light. A nurse passing by stopped briefly, her eyes widening when she recognized him. "That's Keanu Reeves," she murmured softly to a colleague. But Keanu didn't notice, or didn't care. He just sipped his coffee, staring absently at the hospital floor. His eyes, weary and red from lack of sleep, carried the weight of everything that had happened. He wasn't there for recognition. He was there because he couldn't leave until he knew Ethan was okay. Sarah stepped into the hallway, quietly, wrapping her arms around herself. "You should change out of those clothes," she said softly. "You'll catch a cold." Keanu looked up and smiled faintly. "I've been through worse. You didn't have to stay," she said. He shrugged. Didn't feel right leaving yet. Sarah hesitated for a moment, then stepped closer. "The doctor said, if it weren't for you," Keanu shook his head gently, "if it weren't for that dog, I might not have found him at all. He kept barking, even when the wind tried to drown him out. That's what led me to them." Sarah's eyes filled with tears again. "Still," she whispered, "you carried my son through that storm." Keanu glanced down at the paper cup in his hand, turning it absently. "I just did what anyone should do," he said quietly. "A kid shouldn't have to face the dark alone." Sarah stood beside him in the hallway, silent for a long moment. The hum of hospital machines filled the space between their words. Down the corridor, a nurse pushed a cart past them, the wheels squeaking softly against the tile. Keanu leaned back against the wall, eyes heavy, one hand tucked into his pocket. "I don't know how to thank you," Sarah said finally. "If you hadn't stopped on that road." Keanu looked at her, his tired smile faint but genuine. "You don't have to thank me. Just get some rest. You've been through enough tonight." She nodded slowly, wiping her eyes. "When I saw you carrying him out of the woods, I thought I was dreaming." Keanu chuckled softly. "It didn't feel real to me either." He took another sip of his now cold coffee and added, "You've got a strong kid, brave too." Sarah smiled, glancing through the window back at Ethan's room. "He gets that from his dad," she said, then paused. "Or maybe from me, maybe from both." Keanu nodded, understanding. "He's got you," he said gently. "That's what matters." She looked back at him again, her voice softening. "You didn't just save him, you gave me back my whole world." Keanu didn't reply to that. He just looked away, his expression unreadable, the weight of the night settling deeper in his chest. Acts of kindness like this didn't feel like heroism to him. They felt like what people were supposed to do when life gave them the chance. Sarah exhaled slowly. "He'll want to see you when he wakes up." "I'll wait a few more minutes," Keanu said, his voice almost a whisper. She nodded and went back into the room. A few minutes later, the faint sound of Ethan stirring reached the hallway. Keanu straightened, finishing the last sip of his coffee before tossing the cup into a nearby bin. When Sarah opened the door again, she smiled softly. "He's asking for you." Keanu stepped inside quietly. The lights were dim now, the room filled with the rhythmic beeping of a heart monitor and the soft sound of rain outside. Ethan's eyes fluttered open, still heavy with sleep, but when he saw Keanu standing by the door, a small smile spread across his face. "You really came back for me," Ethan said weakly. Keanu pulled a chair closer to the bed and sat down beside him. "Of course I did." The boy's voice was faint. "You didn't have to." Keanu shook his head. "Everyone deserves to be found, kid, even when the world's a mess." Ethan reached out a hand, and Keanu clasped it gently. "Buddy didn't let go," the boy murmured. "He kept me warm." "Yeah," Keanu said softly, looking at the sleeping dog at the foot of the bed. "He's the kind of friend you hold on to." Ethan's eyes began to close again, his grip loosening. "You'll visit again?" Keanu smiled. "Count on it." As the boy drifted back to sleep, Keanu sat there quietly, watching the rise and fall of his chest. Outside, the storm had passed, leaving only calm and the steady rhythm of healing. By sunrise, the world had changed. The storm that had raged through the night was gone, leaving behind a calm so complete it felt almost sacred. The sky, washed clean by hours of rain, glowed pale pink over the distant hills. Water still dripped from the trees, and the roads shimmered with puddles that reflected the first light of morning. The small Oregon town was quiet at first, then slowly came to life. Neighbors emerged from their homes, stepping into the damp air with disbelief. The destruction was visible: fallen branches, flooded yards, scattered debris. But what lingered most was relief. They had all heard the news. The boy was alive. The storm hadn't won. At the fire station, where the search had begun only hours before, volunteers gathered again, this time to rest, share stories, and sip hot coffee from paper cups. Their clothes were still muddy, their faces drawn with fatigue, but there was a quiet pride among them. They had fought the storm together, and they had brought a child home. Keanu stood among them, his hands wrapped around a steaming mug. He had finally changed into dry clothes. Someone had found for him a flannel shirt and worn jeans borrowed from one of the firefighters. His hair was still damp, and his voice hoarse from the night's effort, but his calm presence seemed to steady the whole room. Reporters had already begun to arrive from the nearby city, their vans parked along the road. Cameras flashed, microphones appeared, and voices filled the air with questions. "Is it true Keanu Reeves led the search?" one asked. "Can we get a statement?" shouted another. Keanu held up a hand politely. "Please," he said, "talk to the sheriff, or the volunteers. They're the real heroes here." The sheriff chuckled, shaking his head. "Real heroes? You carried that boy and his dog through a flooded river, Keanu. You risked your life." Keanu smiled faintly, his eyes soft but unwavering. "Anyone would have done the same," the sheriff grinned. "Maybe, but not everyone did." Keanu looked down for a moment, then gave a quiet laugh. "You're kind," he said. "But really, I just showed up at the right time." The sheriff clapped him on the back. "Sometimes that's what being a hero is, showing up when others don't." The volunteers nearby nodded in agreement. Some of them had known Keanu only as the actor from the big screen, but after that night, they saw something different. He wasn't playing a role. He was just a man who cared enough to walk into a storm. When one of the reporters asked for a photo, Keanu declined. "Take one with them instead," he said, gesturing toward the search team. "They're the story worth telling." The reporter hesitated, then smiled and nodded. Soon, cameras turned toward the group of volunteers, muddy boots, tired smiles, and all. Keanu stepped aside, content to watch. The sheriff finished giving a short statement to the press, emphasizing the teamwork that had saved Ethan's life. He spoke about the volunteers who refused to stop searching, the rescue dogs who braved the current, and the small-town resilience that had carried them through. When he was done, he turned to find Keanu quietly helping stack folding chairs near the side of the building. "You know," the sheriff said with a smile, Most folks in your shoes would be giving interviews right now." Keanu looked up, his expression relaxed but sincere. "That's their job," he said. "Mine's done." The sheriff nodded slowly, studying him. "You don't do things halfway, do you?" Keanu chuckled softly. "I try not to." He handed the man another chair. "You got a good town here. People care about each other." "That's what keeps us going," the sheriff replied. "Storms like that remind us what really matters." Keanu looked out toward the distant horizon, where the morning sun broke through the last veil of mist. "Yeah," he said quietly. "They do." A car pulled up near the entrance, and Sarah stepped out, wrapped in a light sweater. Her eyes were still red from crying, but her face carried a peace that hadn't been there the night before. Ethan was resting at the hospital. The doctors said he'd make a full recovery, and Buddy hadn't left his side once. She approached Keanu, hesitating for a moment before speaking. "They said you were still here," she said softly. He smiled. "Couldn't leave without saying goodbye." Sarah's voice trembled. "I don't think I'll ever be able to repay what you did." "You don't need to," Keanu replied. "Just live your life. That's the only thanks I need." She nodded, her eyes filling again. "You really are different," she said. "Most people would have driven past. You stopped." Keanu shrugged gently. "Maybe I just heard something that made me stop." Sarah looked at him for a long moment, then smiled through her tears. "Well, whatever made you stop, I'll thank God for it every day." Keanu reached out and shook her hand firmly. "Take care of that boy," he said. "He's got a brave heart." "I will," she whispered. The sheriff called over from behind them, holding a mug of coffee. "If you ever get tired of Hollywood, Keanu, we could use a guy like you on our rescue team." Keanu laughed lightly. "I think you've got that covered." The sheriff grinned. "Still, don't be a stranger." "I won't," Keanu said, glancing back at Sarah. She gave one last wave before heading to her car. The sheriff turned to him again. "You know, when the story hits the news, people are going to talk about you. You can't stop that." Keanu nodded slowly. "Maybe. But if one person sees it and decides to stop when they hear someone calling for help, then it's worth it." The sheriff smiled. "That's a good way to look at it." Keanu set the last chair down and looked toward the clearing sky. The morning air was cool, but the world felt new again, like something had been washed clean. By midday, the quiet little town that had weathered the storm was no longer quiet. News vans lined the streets outside the hospital. Their satellite dishes pointed to the gray morning sky. Reporters from Portland, Seattle, and even national outlets had arrived, drawn by the story of a Hollywood star who had risked his life for a lost boy. The hospital parking lot, once filled with emergency vehicles, now buzzed with journalists holding microphones and flashing cameras. Keanu stood just outside the main entrance, his hands tucked into his coat pockets. He wasn't dressed like a celebrity, just in jeans and a plain jacket someone from the sheriff's office had lent him. The storm had stripped away the glamour that usually surrounded his name, leaving only the man beneath quiet, humble, and still tired from the night before. Sarah and Ethan stood beside him. The boy was bundled in a thick blanket, Buddy sitting loyally at his feet, tail wagging as people whispered and pointed. Sarah's arm rested gently around her son's shoulders, protective but proud. When the hospital's public relations officer stepped forward to address the crowd, a hush fell. "Thank you all for being here," she began. "As you know, last night's storm was one of the worst our county has faced in years. But thanks to the extraordinary efforts of our rescue volunteers and a helping hand from Mr. Keanu Reeves, a young boy and his dog were brought home safely." The crowd erupted with questions. "Mr. Reeves, how did you find them? Did you know the family? Were you scared?" Keanu smiled slightly, waiting for the noise to settle. "One question at a time," he said calmly. A reporter near the front leaned forward. "Why did you risk your life for people you didn't even know?" The question hung in the air. Cameras clicked. The crowd waited. Keanu looked down at Ethan beside him, who was gazing up with sleepy, trusting eyes. Then he lifted his head, his voice quiet but firm. "Because no one should be lost in a storm," he said simply, "especially a child." The words were soft, unpolished, but they carried weight. The kind of weight that didn't come from fame or a microphone, but from truth. The reporters went silent for a moment before the next round of flashes began, hundreds of photos capturing that still, humble expression on his face. Sarah squeezed his arm gently, whispering, "Thank you," again. Keanu nodded. "You don't have to thank me anymore," he said. "You've said it enough just by being here." Another reporter raised her voice. "Mr. Reeves, what message do you want people to take from this?" Keanu took a moment before answering. "That sometimes," he said, "doing something small, stopping, listening, helping, can change everything. I didn't save that boy alone. Everyone who showed up last night did their part. That's what matters." The crowd murmured in agreement, their cameras lowering slightly. For once, it wasn't just a story. It was a reminder. The cameras continued flashing, but Keanu didn't flinch. His tone remained calm, his eyes steady. He wasn't performing, he was speaking from the same place that had driven him into the storm. "It's easy to think someone else will stop, that someone else will help," he said. "But sometimes, you're the one who's supposed to." A few reporters exchanged glances. There was no dramatic headline in his voice, but that quiet conviction carried more power than any soundbite they could write. Sarah watched him with quiet admiration, her hand resting protectively on Ethan's shoulder. Ethan looked up at Keanu and tugged gently on his sleeve. "Mom says heroes don't wear capes," he said shyly. "She says they just show up when it matters." Keanu smiled down at him. "Your mom's right," he said softly. "And you did the same thing last night, didn't you? You didn't leave your dog behind." Ethan nodded proudly, glancing at Buddy, who was sitting near the hospital door wagging his tail at the growing crowd. Laughter rippled through the reporters, but it was the kind of laughter that came with warmth. The tension that had filled the parking lot began to fade. One of the local journalists, an older man with a notepad instead of a camera, asked quietly, "Mr. Reeves, you've done a lot of things people admire. Movies, charity work, but this feels different. Why not let us give you credit for it?" Keanu looked at him, thoughtful. "Because it's not about credit," he said. "I didn't do it for attention. I did it because I heard someone in trouble. That's all." The man lowered his pen, smiling faintly. "That's a rare answer these days." Keanu gave a half shrug. "Maybe, but I don't think it should be." The public relations officer stepped forward again, trying to guide the conversation to a close. "We'll take one final question," she announced. A young woman near the back raised her hand hesitantly. "Do you think this experience will change you?" Keanu was quiet for a long moment before answering. He glanced toward the horizon, where the last traces of storm clouds drifted across a brightening sky. "Every time you see someone survive something like that," he said softly, "it changes you. You realize how fragile everything is, and how strong people can be when they don't give up." The silence that followed was deeper than applause. It was a silence of reflection, of understanding. Cameras stopped clicking for a few seconds, and all that could be heard was the soft hum of the hospital generator and the faint barking of Buddy greeting another medic. Sarah wiped her eyes again, whispering, "You have no idea how many lives you touched last night." Keanu shook his head. "Maybe just one, but that's enough." As the crowd began to disperse, Ethan reached for Keanu's hand. "Can we visit you someday?" he asked with an innocent smile. Keanu squeezed his hand gently. "You won't need to visit me," he said. "Just grow up and help someone else when they need it." That's how you visit me. Those words, simple, sincere, and human, spread faster than any headline. By evening, they would echo across the country. In the weeks that followed, the town slowly returned to normal, or something close to it. The storm had passed, the power lines were repaired, and the roads cleared. But something had changed in the people who lived there. A quiet spark had been lit, one that refused to fade with the clouds. The story of Keanu Reeves rescuing a boy and his dog spread far beyond Oregon. News outlets called it a miracle in the storm, but the people who had been there knew it was something simpler, an act of compassion that reminded everyone what community really meant. Donations began pouring in from across the country. Some sent money, others sent blankets, food, and rescue gear. Letters arrived at the sheriff's office, addressed to the town that Keanu saved. But the townspeople didn't want the story to end there. They wanted to do something lasting, something that would honor what had happened. It started with a single meeting at the fire station. The sheriff stood at the front of the room, flanked by Sarah and a few of the volunteers who had searched that night. The whiteboard behind them read, "Storm Watchers," in bold letters. Sarah spoke first, her voice strong despite the emotion in her eyes. "That storm showed us how fragile we are, but also how strong we can be when we stand together. I think we owe it to the next family that might need help to be ready next time." The room filled with nods and murmurs of agreement. People signed up that night to join what would become the town's first volunteer emergency search and rescue group. Farmers, teachers, mechanics, even high school students offered to help. They began training on weekends, learning to use radios, ropes, and emergency kits. They called themselves the Storm Watchers, a tribute to the night a storm nearly took one of their own and to the man who refused to let it happen. Ethan, still recovering but full of energy again, insisted on helping. He and Buddy joined the group's weekend gatherings, where he passed out water bottles and snacks to the volunteers. Buddy quickly became their mascot, a living symbol of loyalty and courage. Someone made a small badge for him that read, "Chief Morale Officer," and every time a new volunteer arrived, Buddy greeted them first. Sarah became one of the most active members. She handled logistics, organized supply drives, and helped recruit other parents. "It's not just about rescues," she told a local reporter. "It's about being ready to protect each other, because storms don't wait for heroes. We have to be ready to be our own." Meanwhile, quietly, far from the cameras and headlines, Keanu did his part. He reached out to the sheriff one morning from Los Angeles with a simple request. "What kind of gear are you missing?" he asked. "We'll manage. You've already done enough," Keanu replied. "I didn't ask that." 2 weeks later, a large shipment arrived at the sheriff's office. Inside were waterproof radios, thermal drones, floodlights, and new rescue uniforms with reflective Storm Watchers patches stitched across the chest. The invoice was signed with a single line, "Anonymous donor, for the ones who never stop searching." The sheriff smiled when he saw it. He knew exactly who it came from. At the next town meeting, the equipment was unveiled. The volunteers stood in awe as the sheriff explained where it came from. "We don't know his name officially," he said with a small grin, "but I think you all can guess." A cheer filled the firehouse. Some clapped, others laughed, and a few wiped away quiet tears. Sarah stood in the back, her hand over her heart, while Ethan tugged on her sleeve, whispering, "He did it again, Mom." Buddy barked as if in agreement, tail wagging wildly. When reporters later asked the sheriff for confirmation, he gave the same answer every time. He didn't want credit, he told them. He just wanted others to care. The Storm Watchers quickly became more than just a local effort. Other small towns nearby reached out, asking how to form their own groups. Within months, the project had grown into a small regional network. Each new team carried the same mission to respond when others were lost, whether that meant rescuing hikers, stranded animals, or families displaced by floods. Sarah coordinated much of the outreach. She often told new volunteers the same thing: kindness doesn't need a headline, it just needs a heartbeat. Every time she said it, she thought of the man who had walked into the storm without hesitation. Ethan's story became part of their training lessons. When new recruits gathered for the first time, the sheriff would hold up a small red baseball cap, the same one Keanu had found caught on a branch that night. "This," he'd say, "is why we do what we do." Ethan, who had started middle school by then, liked to tag along whenever the team practiced drills. He carried Buddy's leash and wore a little jacket with a matching Storm Watchers patch. When someone once asked him why he wanted to help, he smiled and said, "Because somebody came for me, now I want to come for someone else." The answer spread across town like sunlight after rain. Months later, when the town hosted its first official Storm Watchers fundraiser, a small envelope appeared in the donation box with no name, just 5 words written in neat handwriting. "Keep looking for the light." The sheriff opened it quietly that night in his office, shaking his head with a knowing smile. Some stories fade with time, but this one didn't. It lived on in every call answered, in every life saved, in every act of compassion sparked by that storm. Keanu never returned for a ceremony, never asked for acknowledgement, but his presence remained not in fame, but in the hearts of the people who learned that night what it truly meant to show up. Several weeks passed before Keanu found himself driving that familiar road again. The sky was clear this time, a calm blue stretching endlessly above the fields. The same stretch of highway that had once been cloaked in darkness and rain now shimmered under the gentle warmth of spring. The scars of the storm had faded, branches cleared, fences mended, puddles long dried. Life had quietly returned to the valley. He slowed his car as he neared the old diner where he'd first seen the flashing lights that night. It looked different in daylight. The neon sign that had flickered through the rain was glowing brightly again, and families sat by the window eating breakfast. For a moment, Keanu considered stopping, but instead, he parked by the side of the road and looked out across the green fields that rolled gently toward the distant tree line. It was peaceful, impossibly peaceful, and for a while, he just sat there, letting the quiet wash over him. It was strange how places carried memories. Even when the danger was gone, the echoes remained. After a few minutes, he turned the car back onto the road and headed toward the Cole farmhouse. The drive felt shorter this time, the road now lined with blooming wildflowers. When he reached the familiar gravel path, he slowed again, smiling at the sight ahead. Sarah and Ethan were in the front yard, tending to a small vegetable garden. Ethan knelt beside Buddy, who was nosing through a pile of tools, his tail wagging furiously. Sarah was the first to notice the car. She stood, shielding her eyes from the sun, and when she recognized him, her face broke into a wide smile. "Ethan," she said, her voice bright with surprise. "Look who it is." Ethan spun around, eyes wide, and then broke into a run. "Keanu!" he shouted, his laughter echoing across the yard. Buddy barked, bounding after him. Keanu stepped out of the car just in time for Ethan to throw his arms around his waist. "You came back!" "Of course I did," Keanu said with a grin, ruffling the boy's hair. "I wanted to see how my favorite hero was doing." Ethan pulled back just enough to show him something shiny hanging from Buddy's collar. A small silver tag, engraved with neat letters. "Look," he said proudly. "We got him a new name." Keanu crouched down beside Buddy, who licked his hand happily. The tag read, "Hero's Best Friend." "That's a good name for him," Keanu said softly. Buddy barked again, as if in agreement, tail thumping against the grass. Sarah walked over, wiping dirt from her hands on her jeans. Her smile was calm this time. No tears, just quiet gratitude. "You really didn't have to come all the way out here," she said warmly. "I wanted to," Keanu replied. "It's nice to see everything growing again." Sarah nodded. "It's been good for him," she said, glancing at Ethan. "For both of us." Ethan ran back toward the garden, Buddy chasing after him with a stick in his mouth. The boy laughed, the sound bright and alive, carrying across the open field. Sarah watched him for a moment, her hands resting on her hips. "He's different now," she said softly. "He's not as afraid of the dark anymore. After that night, I thought he'd never sleep alone again. But now," she smiled, "now he says storms are just nature talking." Keanu chuckled, his eyes following the boy and the dog. "Sounds like he learned how to listen." Sarah turned to him, her expression full of quiet affection. "He learned it from you. You gave me back my son." Keanu shook his head gently. "You gave him his courage," he said. "All I did was walk a path that was already lit by love." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The wind moved softly through the grass, carrying the faint scent of the tilled earth and spring blossoms. It was the kind of silence that didn't feel empty, but whole, a shared understanding that didn't need words. Sarah finally broke it with a warm laugh. "You know," she said, "Ethan's been saving up to buy a little camera. He wants to take pictures of storms. Says he wants to see what heroes see. Keanu smiled at that, looking at the boy now crouched in the garden, helping Buddy dig up a stubborn root. Then maybe he'll show us things we forget to notice, he said. Sarah nodded slowly. Maybe he already does. From the porch, Ethan called out, Keanu, come see, we planted new tomatoes. Keanu walked over, stepping carefully through the rows of young green stems poking through the soil. Looks like you've got a whole farm starting here, he said, kneeling beside him. Mom says we'll give some to the storm watchers, Ethan replied proudly. They helped clean up the woods after the flood. Keanu looked up at Sarah. Storm watchers? She smiled. The rescue group we started. People from all over joined. We got new radios, boots, even training classes. The sheriff said an anonymous donor sent us all the gear. Keanu's lips curved slightly. Sounds like you've got some good people looking out for you. Yeah, Sarah said knowingly, though she didn't press. Good people. Ethan tugged on Keanu's sleeve again. Buddy and me are gonna help too when I'm older. I want to find lost people, just like you found me. Keanu rested a hand on the boy's shoulder. You already found something more important, he said gently. You found who you are. Ethan's eyes lit up, and he grinned. Can I still visit you in the city someday? Keanu smiled. You won't need to. Just keep doing what you're doing. That's enough for me. Buddy barked once more, as if to seal the promise. As Keanu stood to leave, Sarah said softly, You're always welcome here. He turned back with a nod, his smile faint but genuine. I know. The road waited ahead, sunlit and still damp from the morning dew. As Keanu drove away, the farmhouse grew smaller in his rearview mirror, but the warmth of that place, that family, stayed with him long after he disappeared down the winding Oregon road. That night, Keanu checked into a small roadside motel just outside the town. It wasn't the kind of place that stood out a row of 10 rooms, a flickering neon sign that read vacancy, and the faint hum of the ice machine by the office door. The air smelled faintly of rain and cedar. It was quiet now, almost too quiet after the long day. He set his duffel bag down on the small wooden table and sat by the window, watching the drizzle trail down the glass. The world outside was washed clean. The same valley that had once been swallowed by thunder now glowed under a calm, misty moonlight. In the distance, he could see the outline of the hills where the storm had raged weeks earlier. The silence allowed his thoughts to catch up with him. He poured himself a cup of coffee from the old percolator by the sink and opened the small leather journal he carried wherever he went. It was worn from years of travel, the pages filled with scattered notes, sketches, and reflections from film sets, road trips, and quiet nights like this. He flipped to a blank page and sat for a while, pen in hand, but unmoving. His mind drifted back to that night, the sound of Ethan's small voice calling through the storm, the flash of Buddy's eyes in the beam of his flashlight, the rush of water against his knees as he carried them both to safety. He remembered the feeling of the boy's arms clinging tightly to him, the weight of trust in that moment, pure, instinctive, and unspoken. He thought of Sarah's cry when they emerged from the trees, the raw sound of relief that had cut through the storm louder than thunder. Those images came in fragments, but they lingered. Each one was a reminder of how fragile everything could be, how one turn of the wheel, one small decision, could alter the course of someone's life. He thought about how close it had been. If he hadn't stopped, if he'd driven past those flashing lights, a mother might have woken to silence instead of laughter. A boy's story might have ended in the dark. The thought made his chest tighten. Outside, a lone truck passed by on the wet road, its headlights stretching long shadows across the wall. Keanu looked up from his thoughts and watched until the light disappeared. Then he turned back to the page and began to write. His handwriting was slow, deliberate, each word chosen carefully. He didn't write about himself. He never did. He wrote about what he'd seen, what he'd learned, the small truths that stayed behind after the noise faded. He paused, then wrote the first line of the night. Some storms test your strength, others test your heart. He sat back, rereading the words, then continued, letting the quiet guide him. Keanu continued writing. the words flowing quietly under the hum of the motel's old heater. He didn't rush, didn't force meaning onto the page. He simply let the night speak through him. His pen moved slowly, capturing fragments of thought like pieces of the storm that still lingered somewhere inside him. He wrote about the way the world changes after danger passes. How people forget how close they came to losing everything. How the air feels sharper, cleaner, as if the earth itself is grateful for being spared. He thought about Sarah's strength, about Ethan's courage, about how even fear had taught them something beautiful, that love, in its purest form, never hides from the dark. He stopped and stared out the window again. The drizzle had stopped, and the moonlight broke through the thinning clouds, casting silver streaks across the wet pavement. Somewhere out there, the Cole farmhouse slept peacefully. Buddy was probably curled up at the foot of Ethan's bed, and Sarah's light was likely still glowing faintly in the hallway, the way mothers leave a light on not because of fear, but because of love. He smiled faintly at the thought. Then he returned to the page. He wrote about how fragile life truly was, how it could all turn on something as small as a moment's hesitation or a moment's choice. One pause on a rainy road, one decision to stop instead of drive past. He had no grand reason for why he'd done it, no plan, no thought of headlines or gratitude. It was instinct, the simple, human kind, the kind that whispers, "Someone needs help." He remembered the boy's eyes in the darkness. They had held a mix of fear and hope, the kind that only a child's eyes could hold, innocent enough to believe in miracles, brave enough to trust a stranger. He remembered the weight of Buddy in his arms, the warmth of life against the cold, and the sound of Sarah's voice when she cried out his name in the storm. That sound had stayed with him, raw and unforgettable. He closed his eyes, letting the memories play out quietly, like scenes from a film no one would ever see. The difference was, this wasn't a script. It wasn't rehearsed or acted. It was real, messy, unplanned, human. And that was what made it matter. He reached for his pen again, letting the last words form naturally. "Kindness doesn't need an audience," he wrote. "Just timing and heart." He read the line twice, then set the pen down. It wasn't profound in the way interviews wanted quotes to be. It was simple, and that simplicity was enough. He leaned back in the chair and exhaled slowly. Outside, the highway was empty except for the occasional hum of a distant truck. The world had moved on, as it always does after a storm, but a quiet part of him knew that something had shifted for good. He closed his journal and placed it gently on the nightstand. The room felt warm now, not because of the heater, but because of the calm that comes after doing what's right. That quiet assurance that even small acts can ripple through lives long after they're done. As he lay down, the wind outside carried a faint sound, maybe just the rustle of trees, or maybe the echo of a boy's laughter carried from somewhere far away. Keanu smiled in the dark. The storm had tested his strength. The rescue had tested his heart. But the silence that followed tested something deeper, his faith in the quiet power of goodness itself. Months passed, and spring turned to summer. The story of the storm slowly slipped from national headlines, but it never faded in the hearts of those who lived through it. For the Cole family, life had taken on a new rhythm, one built around gratitude, healing, and purpose. Sarah often sat on the porch in the evenings, watching Ethan and Buddy play in the yard. She had started writing again, something she hadn't done since college. Words came to her easily now. Words about courage, kindness, and the unseen heroes who walk quietly among us. It began as a letter to her son, but it grew into something more. Ethan had discovered a love for drawing. He spent hours sketching Buddy, their farmhouse, and the storm. One afternoon, Sarah looked over his shoulder and noticed how beautifully he had drawn a man holding a flashlight against the rain, his face calm and kind. "That's him," Ethan said proudly. "That's Keanu." Sarah smiled, touched by the innocence and depth of her son's understanding. That drawing sparked an idea. Over the next few months, mother and son worked side by side to create a children's book, a simple story told through Ethan's drawings and Sarah's words. They titled it "The Man Who Found the Light." The book told the story of a boy lost in a storm, a loyal dog who refused to give up, and a stranger who followed the bark that led him home. It wasn't written as a celebrity tale or a rescue headline. It was told through the eyes of a child full of wonder, fear, and faith. Each page ended with a gentle message about courage, love, and the light we can all carry inside us. When the book was finished, Sarah showed it to the sheriff, who read it silently, his eyes softening with each page. "You've made something special here," he said. "This story isn't just yours anymore. It belongs to everyone." With help from a local publisher, The Man Who Found the Light was released quietly in the region. To everyone's surprise, it sold out within weeks. Teachers began reading it in classrooms, and families bought it as bedtime stories for their children. It wasn't just a book, it was a reminder of hope. Soon, the town decided to host a small community event to celebrate the release. The proceeds, Sarah insisted, would go toward scholarships for children in rural areas, kids who often felt forgotten, the way she once had growing up. "Every child deserves a chance to be found," she said when she announced it. The sheriff helped organize the event in the same fire station where the storm watchers had first formed. Banners hung from the rafters, and tables were lined with copies of the book. Ethan stood beside a large poster of his illustration, The Man and the Flashlight Shining Through the Storm. The crowd gathered, buzzing with warmth and excitement. The event was small but filled with heart. Families gathered at long tables, decorated with handmade paper lanterns that Ethan and the other children had painted, with scenes from the story, a flashlight beam cutting through rain, a small dog barking against the wind, and a man walking through the storm. The atmosphere was warm and full of laughter. When Sarah took the stage to speak, her voice carried the same calm strength that had seen her through that night months ago. "This book isn't about fame," she told the crowd. "It's about faith. It's about remembering that there's always someone out there willing to stop, to care, and to help. That's what Ethan and I learned from our storm." Applause filled the room, but Ethan stole the moment. Standing proudly beside her, holding a copy of The Man Who Found the Light, he said, "It's about finding people who make the world brighter." Then he looked down at Buddy, who wagged his tail like he understood every word. The sheriff stepped forward next. He held up a small card that had arrived in the morning's mail. No return address, just a neat, handwritten note on simple stationery. The crowd fell silent as he read it aloud. "Keep shining. The world remembers light more than storms." There was no signature, but no one needed one. Sarah closed her eyes for a brief moment, smiling through the emotion that caught in her chest. Even from far away, Keanu's voice had a way of finding the right time, quiet, sincere, and full of meaning. After the speeches, the townspeople lined up to buy books, each one signed by Sarah and stamped with Ethan's small doodle of Buddy. Every dollar went into the new Lightkeeper Scholarship Fund, a program designed to help rural children pursue art, writing, or rescue work. Sarah had insisted that kindness should keep moving forward. Later that evening, as the crowd thinned and the lights dimmed, Sarah stood outside the fire station with Ethan and Buddy beside her. The sheriff joined them, folding the note carefully and slipping it back into his pocket. "He really didn't want any attention, did he?" Sarah smiled softly. "No, he just wanted people to care." The sheriff nodded. "Well, he got his wish. Look around, everyone. Here's carrying a piece of that night with him." Sarah looked at her son, who was now helping another boy tie one of the lanterns to the fence. The light glowed softly against the dusk, tiny flames flickering like stars reborn. "He gave us more than help," she said quietly. "He gave us a story worth passing on." The sheriff glanced toward the horizon, where the last traces of sunset faded into night. "Stories like that never die," he said. And he was right. The Man Who Found the Light became a local treasure, read in classrooms and bedtime routines, shared between families when storms rolled through. Far away, in another city, Keanu Reeves kept a single copy of the book on his shelf. He never mentioned it in interviews, never spoke of that night again, but every so often, when thunder rolled across the sky, he would glance at the cover, smile, and whisper, "Keep shining." The video closes not with noise, but with silence, the kind that lingers after the storm. A soft piano melody plays over distant sounds of wind and rain. On the screen, real footage of storms unfolds. Dark clouds rolling over farmlands, lightning splitting the night sky, rivers swelling with rainwater. Then, slowly, the images shift. Volunteers wading through floodwaters, rescue workers carrying children, strangers helping strangers. The world, in all its chaos, finding its balance again through compassion. Over the montage, Keanu's voice plays steady, calm, and filled with quiet conviction. No one should be lost in a storm, he says, especially a child. The words echo softly, blending with the piano chords. They're not spoken like a slogan. They're spoken like a truth. The camera fades to the Oregon countryside where sunlight filters through the mist. The fields that were once drowning in rain now shine with new life, green, breathing, alive. The Cole farmhouse stands tall in the distance, surrounded by blooming gardens. Sarah is in the yard, her hands in the soil. Ethan is chasing Buddy through the grass, his laughter clear and bright. There is no drama in this ending, only peace, the kind that comes when healing finally takes root. The narrator speaks gently. Sometimes, the storms we fear the most aren't just outside. They're within us, moments of fear, loss, and uncertainty. But somewhere in that darkness, someone always reaches out a hand. Sometimes a stranger, sometimes a friend. And that small act can change everything. Images of the man who found the light appear next children in classrooms holding the book, reading aloud the words Sarah wrote and the drawings Ethan made. Teachers smile as they turn the pages, their students listening wide-eyed to the story of courage and kindness. The narrator continues, one quiet decision, one choice to certain, stop instead of keep driving, became a story that traveled across generations. That's the power of kindness. It begins in silence, but echoes forever. As the piano swells, short clips appear of the Storm Watchers group in action. Volunteers fitting on bright yellow vests, loading trucks with supplies, teaching kids about safety and compassion. A brief shot shows a drone lifting into the sky, scanning a flooded valley. The camera pans to a small engraving on the side of the rescue van that reads, "In honor of the ones who stop." Then the screen cuts to Keanu's journal resting on a wooden table. The page from that night is open, the ink slightly smudged, but the words clear. Kindness doesn't need an audience, just timing and heart. The narrator pauses for a moment before speaking again, softer this time. The world may remember the actor, but the people in that town remember something deeper, a moment of light in the dark. The story of one man who showed that sometimes the greatest roles aren't played on a stage, but in the quiet places where no one is watching. The music slows, carrying the audience into stillness, the kind that invites reflection rather than applause. The piano continues softly as the final scenes unfold, a collage of humanity at its best. A firefighter lifting a child from a flood, a teenager handing out blankets during a blizzard, a family opening their door to strangers on a cold night. Acts of compassion that rarely make headlines, yet define who we are when no one's watching. The narrator's voice returns, calm and thoughtful. Storms will always come, the kind that flood towns and the kind that flood hearts. But what matters most is who we become in those moments. Sometimes the smallest decision to listen, to stop, to care, becomes the difference between despair and hope. A final shot shows Ethan, older now, standing on a hill with Buddy beside him, holding a flashlight in his hand. He switches it on as the sun sets, its beam cutting through the twilight. It's the same gesture Keanu once made in that storm, a quiet passing of light from one heart to another. The screen fades to black, and Keanu's quote appears in white letters across the darkness. No one should be lost in a storm, especially a child. The piano melody lingers a few moments longer, then softens as the narrator delivers the closing reflection. Kindness doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers in the dark, through the voice of a stranger who refuses to drive past. Sometimes it lives in the laughter of a child who learned what courage means. And sometimes it waits quietly inside each of us until the moment we choose to let it out. Clips fade in of the man who found the light, displayed in libraries and bookstores. Children are seen reading it aloud at community centers, their small voices full of wonder. The sheriff gives a talk at a nearby school, holding up the book as he tells the students, "This isn't just a story. It's proof that one person can change everything." Then, one last image, a close-up of the original red baseball cap found in the woods, now displayed in a glass case at the fire station. A small plaque beneath it reads, "In memory of the storm that brought us together." The narrator's voice lowers to a gentle close. In a world that often celebrates noise, there's something sacred about silence, the kind that follows an act of love. Maybe that's where real heroism lives. Not in applause, not in fame, but in the quiet certainty that you did something good when no one was looking. The piano fades into the sound of soft rain, returning once more to the rhythm that started it all. The screen fades to black again, and two final questions appear in white text. Have you ever met someone who helped you when you were lost? What kind of story should we tell next about Keanu Reeves' quiet heroism? The music pauses, leaving only the sound of gentle rain, a moment for viewers to reflect, to feel, and perhaps to remember their own storm.